Are you familiar with the series The Cat in the Hat Knows a Lot About That? Probably only if you have small children like me. It's a children's show based on Dr. Seuss's The Cat in the Hat. I have 3 small children. My older 2 are boys, and they love The Cat in the Hat Knows a Lot About That. My 3rd's a baby and hasn't really formed an opinion on it yet. Dorian, who's almost 2, calls it Go, 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 because each episode they sing this catchy song. Here we go, 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 go on an adventure. My kids don't watch a lot of TV, so when they do, it's like magic. Actually, so you can better imagine it, here's a pic of one of their recent viewing parties. Notice the difference in your attention now that I've put this picture in front of you. When it was a blank screen, you had to listen to me or be distracted on your own, but I wasn't providing anything to distract you. But as soon as I put something in front of you, now your attention is split. Still, there can be magic with images. The graph is one type of image. Once you see something, you can remember what you saw. This is powerful. By combining the verbal, what I say, with the visual, what I show, we put ourselves in a position for success when it comes to communicating with data. We'll talk more about that momentarily. Back to the Cat in the Hat. The basic structure is the same each time. The main characters, Nick and Sally, encounter a question through their play. The Cat in the Hat shows up and takes them on an adventure to do some first-hand research or meet with an expert who can answer their question. Then they go back home and practice applying what they learned. For example, last week we were watching an episode where Nick and Sally really wanted to see the butterfly's beautiful wings, but they could never get close enough to it. So the Cat in the Hat showed up, took them to see a sloth who taught them the art of moving slowly. And they went back home and tried this out, and the butterfly landed close enough to them that they were able to see its beautiful wings. Now, this got me thinking. This process is actually quite similar to one aspect of many professional jobs. Someone asks you a question. Your boss, your colleague, your CEO. You have to do some research, perhaps talk to experts, maybe analyze some data in order to answer that question. And then, once you've found your answer, you have to communicate that back to your audience in a way that's going to be understood. That's my area of expertise. I like to think of what I do as telling stories with data. And today, our adventure will focus on that. Now, usually I do this through day-long workshops, but I'm not going to spend a day on this right now. Rather, I'm going to spend a matter of minutes. In thinking about what I could cover quickly, I came up with just 2 simple things that you can do for big impact. Thing 1, be sparing and intentional in your use of color. Use it to signal to your audience where you want them to look. Thing 2, put your thoughts into words. Use words to make your graphs accessible and say what you mean. When it comes to communicating with data, if you only do these 2 things, you'll be in a great position for getting your message across. Let's take a look at some specific lessons and examples. First, be sparing and intentional in your use of color. So I'm going to start this section off with a brief conversation on how we see. This is a super simplified picture of that process. On the left-hand side, we have light refracting off a stimulus. This gets captured by our eyes. Now, we don't fully see with our eyes. Rather, they act sort of like cameras, take pictures of the world around us, pass those pictures via electrical signals onto our brain. And it's in our brain where what we think of as visual perception takes place. Now, in the brain, there are a couple of types of memory that are important to know when it comes to communicating visually. We're going to talk about one of those today, which is iconic memory. Iconic memory is super short-term, and information stays there for fractions of a second before it gets forwarded onto our short-term memory. The really cool thing about iconic memory is that it's tuned to a specific set of what we call pre-attentive attributes, and color is one of those attributes. So let's actually pause there and do a little exercise. In a moment, I'm going to put a bunch of text up on the screen here. What I'd like you to do is count how many times the word cat appears in this text. Ready? Here we go. So if you counted 5, you are correct. This took a bit of work though. You have to scan through all of this text, look for cat, keep track of the count of it, check out how much the exercise changes though when I make one small change. Suddenly there are 5 cats in front of you. This is so apparent so quickly because I'm leveraging your iconic memory. I'm using the pre-attentive attribute of hue, or color in this case, to make cat the one thing that stands out as distinct from all the rest. And this is really interesting because what this shows us is that we can use color in this way to direct our audience's attention to where we want them to look, almost before they even know what they're doing. So we see here how this works well in text. This can also work well in images. In this image, for example, we have a lot of color going on. The way it's used here currently, though, doesn't tap into our pre-attentive attributes, into our iconic memory the way that it could. With color used everywhere, we lose the pre-attentive value. But check out what happens if we push everything to the background and then use color just in one place or another. By doing this, I'm able to focus your attention where I want you to look without ever telling you where you need to look. This is really powerful. Now, as you can imagine, this also becomes very useful when it comes to directing attention in our data visualizations. So here is an example graph. This one shows how our annual customer survey results have looked for the recent period. We can see how we've fared across a number of dimensions. So I can use color similarly to how we just looked at in the cat and hat example to direct your attention to one part of the data. Maybe we want to pause and celebrate success. Price and convenience, we're doing awesome there. Let's pause and congratulate ourselves for some good work. Or we can use this same strategy to draw attention to the other end. But we're struggling when it comes to relationship and brand. What can we do to positively impact these areas? Take a look at another example. So let me set up the context here. For this one, you have to imagine that you work at a food manufacturing company. You are getting ready to launch a new yogurt product called Craveberry. And you've recently done some consumer taste testing of the product, and you want to recommend a couple minor changes based on what you've found through this data to further improve the product. Here's what it looks like if we take our taste test data and throw it in a graph. I'll walk you through quickly what we're looking at here first. So all of our survey respondents could assess a number of dimensions shown down the left-hand side: thickness, amount of fruit, sweetness, size, creaminess, and amount of yogurt. For each of these dimensions, they could tell us there was not enough, it was just about right, or there was too much. Consider how we're using color currently. How does it feel? If you get caught up on just about right being rendered in red, which feels just about wrong, you are not the only one. This is an example of what can happen when we let our tool pick our colors for us. Choice of color is probably one of the most important decisions you can make when it comes to your data visualization and drawing your audience's attention. You never want to let your tool make this important decision for you. Your tool simply doesn't know the data, doesn't know the story, doesn't know where you want to direct your audience's attention in the way that you do. So let's see what we could do here. We could start by pushing everything to the background, similar to what we saw with the cat in the hat image example earlier. And now I can use color sparingly to draw attention to one piece at a time. Maybe we want to focus folks where there's not enough of something. Or perhaps there's some discussion to be had about where things are going well, where things are just about right. Or we could focus on the other end, where we have too much of given aspects of our product. We'll come back to this example in a bit. In the meantime, on to thing 2, put your thoughts into words. I think oftentimes when we communicate with data, it feels like words shouldn't have a place, right? It's data visualization, it should be pictures. But words have a very important place in making those data visualizations accessible to our audience. There are some words that have to be there. Every graph needs a title, every axis needs a title. It just rules out any confusion on the part of your audience of what they're looking at. You can annotate important points directly on the graph. The best place to put text when you're doing that is as close to you can as what you're describing, so long as it doesn't obscure the data. Also, anytime you're showing data, you should have a footnote that has the source, the as of date, any necessary assumptions or methodology points, which will vary depending on your situation and your audience. When it comes to positioning of text, your audience without other visual cues will typically start at the top left of your page or your screen and do zigzagging Z's across, which means they hit the top left of your graph first. So personally, I like to left uppermost justify my text because it means that my audience will see the text before they get to the data. So then by the time they get to the data, they already know what they're looking at. When it comes to positioning on the page, the title bar in a presentation application is precious real estate, and yet so often we use it for descriptive titles. Think about instead using that space for active titles. It's the first thing your audience encounters when they see your page or your slides. It can really work well for setting the tone, setting the expectation for what's to follow on the rest of the slide. Let's take a look at some examples of descriptive titles that I commonly see and some ideas for how we might turn them into active titles. First, 2016 budget and actuals. Instead of just telling your audience what's going to come on the page, tell them how they should be thinking about it, what they should be seeing. So an example of a more active title here could be spending is on track with budget, or spending's over budget, or spending's under budget. Use that framing to help set their expectation more specifically. Market conditions. We might substitute with something like favorable market conditions continue. And here we don't have any actual content or specific data that we're working on, so I'm making some assumptions when it comes to turning the descriptive titles into active titles. You certainly would want to use your content and your data to figure out what the right framing would be for your given situation. Sales forecast. Be more specific by saying how we're doing against that sales forecast. Marketing efforts. Could replace with something like, we're building awareness in these 5 ways. If there's not a specific takeaway or action that you need to frame up, but this still gives your audience the lens that, okay, they should be looking for 5 things when they get to the content that you'll be covering next. Or one of my personal favorite slide titles, being totally sarcastic there, executive summary. I'd like you to try to never use the words executive summary at the top of a page. Instead, think about using that precious space for what action or decision you're trying to drive. Another point on words, say what you mean. Don't assume that 2 different people looking at the same graph are going to walk away with the same conclusion, which means if there is a conclusion you want your audience to reach, you should put it in words and use what we know about pre-attentive attributes, color, position on page, to make those words stand out. Strike a balance between spoken and written. Whenever you're crafting a communication, you want to think ahead to how you'll be delivering that communication. Are you going to be there talking your audience through it, or is it something that's going to be emailed out and you won't be there? Each of these scenarios will have a very different balance when it comes to how much you say and what's written down. So you want to strike the appropriate balance there. Avoid overly complex language. Simplify. One of my important roles at Google was helping translate what was sometimes highly statistical language into plain English, to help people understand what we had done, what we had found, and how they should act upon it. Now, this is not about oversimplifying, but rather about not making things more complicated than they have to be. And finally, SOAAO. Spell out acronyms at least once. You want to make sure your audience can understand what you're saying. So never assume that everybody in your audience is going to know what an acronym means. At least put it in a footnote, because you always can have the situation where somebody started yesterday and they won't know, and you don't want to run the risk of them not getting the message because you haven't spelled out what you're saying. Let's look back now at the examples that we touched upon in the section on color. So celebrate where you're doing well. This slide here might be appropriate if I'm standing in front of an audience and I can talk to it and discuss some of the context and other things around it. Probably wouldn't want to put more text on the screen if I'm there to talk through it. If, though, it's something that's being sent out, then I want to make it stand on its own. So then I might add some more text there that has the context that I would say in my voiceover. And again, we can use this same strategy on the other end of the spectrum, right? Areas in need of change, here they are, here's the conversation we want to have or the action we want to drive as a result of this. And now let's look to the second example that we looked at previously with the taste test data. Now let's start by putting the words there that need to be there. Descriptive graph title, axis titles, footnote with my data source and some information on the survey. And now I want to think about how I can put my thoughts more clearly into words. I might come up with something like this. Notice the active title, more yogurt, less fruit to increase satisfaction. So it's already clear once I've read that title what I should be looking for when I get to my graph and what I can expect when it comes to the text that's on the page. We have the graph there. We've used color to draw attention to some different places on it. We have some annotation on the right-hand side. Here's where we're doing well, tied via color to the points in the data that support it. Here's some room for improvement. And then finally, our recommendation. So we talked a little bit before about the difference when you are presenting live versus something that's being sent out. This is probably too much text, too much going on for a live presentation. But if this is something that's being sent out or to summarize the discussion that was had, this would be probably just about right. So we've looked at a couple lessons, being sparing and intentional in your use of color, putting your thoughts into words. If you only do two things, these two things will put you in a pretty good position for success. But if you want to do more, the place I'd encourage you to spend more time is on telling a story. Let's take a quick look at how this final example that we just looked at could play into a story. So I might start by setting the context. My goal today is twofold. First, I want to share the results of this recent taste test that we undertook, create a common understanding of what's going on there and what we learned. Secondly, I'm going to recommend a couple minor changes that we think are going to go a really long way when it comes to improving customer satisfaction on this product. I want you to leave here today both understanding these changes and being ready to make these changes. So before we even get into the data itself, let me set up for you what we're going to be looking at. So we asked 100 people how they felt about craveberry yogurt across a number of dimensions. We see those along the left-hand side there. Thickness, amount of fruit, sweetness, size, creaminess, amount of yogurt. For each of these dimensions, they could tell us there was not enough, it was just about right, or there was too much. See that across the top. Let's throw our data up there. Now let's focus first on where things are going well. In particular, sweetness and size. More than 50% of respondents said we're doing well there, things are just about right, without any clear directional change. So I want to leave those just as they are. However, there were some areas where people indicated we may want to make some changes. In particular, more than half of respondents thought the product was too thick. It had too much fruit and not enough yogurt. So the change we recommend is an easy one. We want to decrease the amount of fruit and increase the amount of yogurt, which we believe will have the impact of decreasing overall thickness and ultimately make it a product that our consumers are going to be more satisfied with. So my story, my presentation that I take my audience through could look like that. And then the final page that gets left with my audience or is sent around to the people who weren't able to attend the meeting has all of this annotated directly on it. So those are my quick lessons of the day. If you do nothing else, do these two things. Thing one, be sparing and intentional in your use of color. Use it to draw your audience's attention to where you want them to pay it. Thing two, put your thoughts into words. Use words to make your graphs accessible and to say what you mean. So with that, I say a very big thank you. If you want more, check out my book, Storytelling with Data, a data visualization guide for business professionals. There's also a lot more information and examples and tips on my website, storytellingwithdata.com. Thanks for watching.